Well, it's winter, and this is going to be the last video in the series on the off-grid camper in the woods, at least covering the 4 basics of survival: shelter, water, fire, and now food. I was going to do this video in the camper, but it's so dark and dreary, and there's really not a lot to show, so I figured I'd come out here in the woods and just enjoy the outdoors a bit and just share my thoughts on food and what I did, what I'm doing now, and the whole process of acquiring food living off grid. I gotta show you something first though. I don't have a tripod, I'm just using my phone. So how am I gonna mount this camera out in the woods to do this video? Well, I just made a snow pod. Mounted up a little snow with a little back support. And there you go. You're sitting on a little mound of snow. So I think, keeping with the survival aspect of this, the easiest way to explain food in this scenario would be to go through the history of food and mankind. So originally we were hunter-gatherers. We hunted, we fished, and we gathered whatever plants and stuff that grew naturally, and we used them. Then we evolved a little further, and we started gathering some of those wild plants and wild animals and domesticating them and cultivating them, and that's how we ended up with farming and gardening. So that was the next stage of food in mankind's history. Now, getting beyond that, we started doing trading with nearby villages or faraway civilizations, depending on who we were at the time in history. So maybe we had a lot of gold, we would trade that for food, or maybe we had timber and people needed timber to build stuff, but they had lots of food and we didn't, so we traded back and forth, and that's how trading came to be. Eventually, we stopped doing the barter method of trade, and we actually went to gold and silver and money, which is the main source of trading these days, just money in hand or plastic in hand. And getting beyond that even, there's always begging for food. Once civilization became established and people were prosperous, people who weren't prosperous realized that they could just ask other people for food, and if they asked enough people, eventually someone would help them out. So those are the basics of food throughout history: hunter-gatherer, farmer-gardener, barter and trade, and begging. At least from my viewpoint. And I've kind of did a bit of all of them living here. But I wanted to show the history so that I can kind of show my thought process in selecting the property I selected, because I believe when it comes to off-grid living, regardless of whether you're in a camper, a cabin, a house, whatever, location is the number one thing. And even throughout history, for farmers, hunters, gatherers, traders, it was always about location. The traders, if they were in a port city and they had ships, then obviously that was going to be a big trading nation, like Spain and India and things of that nature throughout history. And all the port towns were the ones that prospered the most, because that's where all the trading took place. Same with hunter-gatherers. Communities or groups or tribes of people who lived or controlled areas with large populations of wild game or wild edibles were the ones that prospered the most. And they actually fought to keep control of those areas. Here in America, a lot of the areas that we now hunt were actually hunting grounds. Nobody lived there at all. They were simply hunting grounds for different native tribes, and the tribes would fight each other for control and access to those hunting grounds. And a lot of these tribes traveled hundreds and hundreds of miles, even from other states here to Michigan, to hunt certain areas. And throughout the country, it was that way. And they didn't have horses or anything. They were doing it all on foot. So you see how location is key to any of this. Now I kind of just fell into a good location. It wasn't necessarily planned out, but I want to explain some of the benefits of this location and how that plays into those four methods of gathering or acquiring food. Well, first thing I thought when I was searching for a property is it'd be nice to have a place that has a lot of wild game, a lot of fish and game, a lot of wild edibles, because I know a lot about that. I know how to hunt and fish, and I know a lot about wild edibles. So that would be a good ace in the hole fallback for food if I really needed it. And I just happened to fall into a place that has an abundance of wild game. Everything from bear, deer, turkey, grouse, squirrel, rabbit, you name it. All different species of fish. There's lots of, I got the creek right here that has brown trout and rainbow trout running up at all times of year. So that's a good source of food if I really need it. So that was number one. That's that primal, primitive, most primitive source of acquiring food. Hunter-gatherer. Hunt, fish, and gather wild edibles. Now, where I'm at, it's mostly woodlands, and it's not a really diverse woodland environment, so there's really not a lot in the way of wild edibles other than perhaps acorns. I could gather a whole lot of acorns, and that's a really good food source. But it does take a lot of time to gather them and prepare them and process them and store them and all that. But it's nice to know that I have that to fall back on if I really need it. Now, the next step up would be farming and gardening. I know a lot of people that are into the off-grid living or living a sustainable, self-sustainable, self-reliant life. One of the first things you think of is, well, I'm going to have a bunch of chickens or goats or cows or pigs or whatever, but usually it's chickens is the first thing I see everybody talking about. And it's the thing that I see everybody complaining about is, oh, well, I can't have chickens where I live, and I'm going to buck the system and fight the system and have chickens anyway, or try to fight to get chickens. Obviously, if you're already in a location, there's not much you can do other than try to make the change to get farming or gardening or whatever legal in your area. But if you have the option, it'd be good to do the research prior to purchasing a property to see if that location is a place where you can raise chickens and goats and have a farm and a garden and all that. Well, lucky for me, I'm in a location where it's basically agricultural, and I can have any kind of farm animals I want. And I don't have to ask anybody. I just go get them and raise them. Again, you're going to be looking into an investment of money to keep those chickens and wild pigs or whatever up, and also a pretty good investment of time in raising them and taking care of them if they get sick, butchering them, things of that nature. So those are all things that we need to consider if we're planning on doing that. But again, it's really all about location. If you are planning on farming, then search for a location where it's okay to do farming, and you're not going to have any issues, at least in that regard. My cat's right here, biting me, of course. Smoo! Smoo's so mean. Just totally gnawing on my hand. Smoo has no problem hunting, living the hunter-gatherer lifestyle. Smoo gets plenty of voles and mice and stuff, and could live out here no problem. But so getting back to it, a good location that has a lot of wild game, where there are no regulations or anything that would prevent you from hunting and fishing for a sustenance way of life. And then next would be having a location where you can garden and farm and not have issues with that. My location isn't too happening for gardening. Obviously for farming I could raise livestock and stuff, no problem. But for farming, it's all wood, or gardening, it's all woodland, so there's not a lot of sun getting in. I did try and grow some different types of veggies, and the only thing that really grew were the beans. Well, honestly, I planted every single vegetable seed I had when I first got here, and the only thing that grew were beans, squash, and corn. The Three Sisters garden. The only thing that did good of those three were the beans, that produced a viable crop where I could save seeds or eat them for the next season. So for me, gardening, unless I were to go through and cut down a whole bunch of trees and cultivate the soil, would be a little hard to do. Next up would be trading. I guess in everyday life we really don't think of trading for food, but that's what we do. We take our money and we trade it for food. So am I in a location where it's going to be easy for me to access trading posts or the town or the store or whatever? If I were to pick a location that was extremely good for hunting and fishing, but was way out in some remote area where I was maybe 100 miles or 50 miles away from the nearest store, I'm kind of setting myself up to, one, have it be very difficult to get to the place to buy or trade for food, and for two, it's going to be much more expensive. The further away the stores are, the more expensive it's going to be for you to buy or get to transport yourself to buy that food. So those are all things to keep in mind. Again, I was lucky in my location because even though I am somewhat remote, being that I'm totally surrounded by forest for miles and miles, I'm still close enough to town that I could walk or ride my bicycle or use a car and get there in a relatively short amount of time. When I was just using my bike for transportation, I would ride up to the store. I would try to do it once a month and get all my groceries for the month on that one trip, because I had to make a lot of other trips for other things, so I wanted to get the food shopping out of the way one time a month, so I would have the rest of the month and the rest of the week to ride around on my bike and get whatever else I needed or do whatever else I needed to do. Because I have that little cargo trailer I have is limited in size, so there's only so much I can bring back and forth in that. Now that I have a van, I can pretty much go anywhere and shop anywhere I want within 50 miles or whatever. But it's nice to have a place close by that you can walk to, or at least ride a bicycle to if need be, at least in my opinion, because that way if something hits the fan and I don't have a car, at least I know I have a way to get there by foot or by a bicycle, something that isn't going to cost me any real money to maintain or get around on. So location is important for the trading aspect, because we really, if we have the option, we want to be close enough so that it's not a huge inconvenience to get to these places to do our shopping for food and stuff. And also, by doing that, it's going to be a lot less expensive to buy that food. I think we all watch the TV shows, and some of these people that live in remote areas, just to get some flour or sugar or salt or basic food items, potatoes, onions, apples, they have to pay an arm and a leg to have somebody fly that stuff in with a plane. And it's just, you almost would have to have a pretty good source of income and attach yourself and not be self-reliant in order to live that lifestyle, because you're going to have to pay so much money just to get those basic food items that you're going to have some source of income coming in to pay for it. If you put yourself close, then you're going to be more self-reliant, because you're not going to have that huge expense of having somebody fly it in, or having to drive 50 miles one way to go get your food and spend a fortune in gas or whatever. You can always just ride your bicycle up there, and it doesn't cost you nothing but maybe a new inner tube once a year. And again, this isn't like I planned this all out. This all just fell into place. But these are things that I think are important to consider. And I think one of the biggest reasons people fail or decide not to live an off-grid or somewhat more self-reliant lifestyle is because they set themselves up by not doing the prior research and finding a suitable location for what they want to do. So it's really important to, if we can, research prior to getting a location, and try and find a location that has the things we want, so that we're not setting ourselves up for failure. It goes back to another acronym that people in the survival community use. It's well, I'll shorten it a bit. It's the 5 P's. Prior planning prevents poor performance. Prior planning prevents poor performance, the 5 P's. If we plan things out prior to doing them, and we weigh the pros and cons, and we look at the negatives and the positives, and what could go wrong, what can go right, then we can make a better decision and set ourselves up for success rather than failure. Of course, bad things can always happen, and all the planning in the world isn't going to prevent that, but at least we can make the best effort and give ourselves the best chance of survival if we do the prior planning. So that would be the third method of getting food, trading. Now, what about begging? Well, a lot of us in the survivalist or prepping or gardening and farming, self-reliant community, we're really proud. We're proud that we can take care of ourselves, and we'd never want to think that we'd be somebody to go out and beg for food. But when you're thrust into a situation, hopefully, at least I realized that I had to set my pride aside and ask for help. And to be honest with you, that's exactly what I did. I took help from the state to get food. Otherwise, I would have starved. So that's another thing to consider, is the location that you're thinking of living. Is there access to state and local help for food and stuff if you really need it? Or do you really need it? It's nice always to have multiple ways to get the thing you need. 3 different ways to get fire, 3 different ways to get shelter, 3 different ways to get water, 3 different ways to get food, at least. So, having the ability to hunt and gather, to farm or garden, to trade for food, and if I really need to beg for food, those are all good things to have if you need them. That way you've always got a backup. So does the location you're planning on living have resources like that available, whether it be organizations, businesses, churches, the state, the county? Is there help available for food if you really need it? And that's pretty much it. Again, I was lucky. The place I live, it's relatively poor area. There's not a whole lot of people, but there are a lot of churches around, and there are a lot of organizations around to help people with food and things if they really need it. So those are all things to consider. And I think that's probably when it comes to food, I think that's the only real thing to consider when we're thinking about living a self-reliant or off-grid lifestyle is the place that I live or I want to live, will it support the methods of acquiring food that I want? If I go there, can I farm and garden? Can I get to a store to buy food? Is there organizations around that will help me with food if I need it? Is it a place where I can do a lot of hunting and fishing? For me, I lucked out. I got all four of those things. They're all available to me if I need them. It's just a matter of doing it. It's so nice out. I think it's in the 20s today, I'm not sure, but it has been really cold. I woke up the other morning to go to work, and the thermostat in my car said it was minus 13 outside without the wind chill. My pipes froze, and for 6 days I didn't have any water. Luckily, I had a little water stored away, and I was able to, well, I actually went and bought a couple of them 2.5-gallon jugs of water. That's another reason to be close to civilization, so that if something like that happens, you have the option of, going and getting water or whatever. Obviously, I could come right down here to the creek and get water, but I have to walk up a very steep 20 to 30 foot hill, which is covered with a foot of snow, and underneath that it's solid ice. It's kind of tough doing that when you got 2 5-gallon buckets of water and walking another 15 minutes or 5-10 minutes through the woods with through a foot of snow with over logs and branches and stuff with a couple buckets of water. It's doable, but it's a lot easier just running to the store and grabbing a couple things of water, or taking a couple jugs to work and filling them up with water if you need to. Not that I haven't come down here and got water, because when I first moved here, I didn't have a van or a car or anything. So I just had the bicycle, and it's hard to transport water on the bike, so I would just come down to the creek and get water if my well wasn't working or whatever. I did that quite a lot. And then I would just purify the water with bleach. That's how I did it. My legs falling asleep squatting down like that. Well, I guess that's about it. A couple other things I'll mention. As far as cooking food and things of that nature, I live in a camper, that's powered by liquid propane and solar power. So I have a propane stove that I use to cook, propane range top that I use to cook my food, and all the normal cooking utensils that everyone else uses. The only difference to that would be my space heater, which has a nice flat surface on top, and I can bake a turkey on that in a roasting pan covered with tin foil. I mentioned that in a prior video, and I showed the space heater in a prior video, so there's no sense in showing that again. I can reheat food on a space heater by wrapping it in tin foil. As far as food preservation, the camper came with a liquid propane powered refrigerator. Now that refrigerator freezer, it can actually run on liquid propane, 12 volt power, or 110 electric. But it's not a normal refrigerator. It doesn't have the ventilation that a normal refrigerator would have, and the temperature, even if it's in optimum brand new condition, fluctuates up and down. I looked in the owner's manual, and even when it was brand new, the owner's manual states that that refrigerator freezer is really only meant to keep food for about a 2-week period. It's not a permanent solution for food preservation. I had lots of issues with it freezing my food, or the food getting a little bit too warm and getting rancid or going bad. So I ended up not using that, and I just went to using canned goods, dry goods, and if I wanted fresh food, I would just get fresh food for that day or for however long it would last unrefrigerated and use it up before it went bad. Some veggie, plant type food items that keep well: potatoes, onions, and apples. Those keep the best, and they provide a really good source of food. Carrots kind of keep okay. There's ways to keep carrots though, fresher longer, but my main issue being here in the woods and in Michigan is there's high humidity, so it's really hard to keep food fresh without freezing it or drying it and storing it in a way that it can't absorb moisture. So that's what I did for food. Potatoes, onions, apples, a lot of dried nuts and berries and fruit, a lot of canned fruit, canned veggies, canned meats. And if I want fresh food, which I usually eat, a couple times a week or whatever, I just go up to the store and I buy some fresh meat or fresh veggies, and I cook it up that day and use it up. A lot of foods that I like, I pretty much tried keeping every kind of veggie and fruit that I could think of. I don't really like oranges. They would probably keep well. Bananas keep fairly well. But cherries, grapes, tomatoes, they rot almost within 2 or 3 days. They rot. They're no good. I did keep some peppers outside, and surprisingly enough, when kept outside, the peppers stayed fresh for weeks and weeks. But as soon as I take them in the camper, within just 2 or 3 days, they're pretty much rotten. So after a long process of getting sick on mildly spoiled food, or eating rancid meat, or having my eggs explode in the refrigerator because they froze and making a mess, and all these different things, I ended up just going with canned goods and dry goods, and the potatoes, onions, and apples, and bananas, and everything else either dried or canned. And if I want fresh food, I just go that day and get it and eat it that day, like hamburger or whatever. Now that when fall came, I bought a styrofoam cooler, and I was getting bags of ice and keeping my food cold that way, and it worked good for hamburger and chicken and everything. But the problem I had with the bags of ice is they would obviously leak out, and then the inside of the cooler would get wet, and you'd end up with that same situation I had with the propane fridge. Is there was a moisture issue and everything would mold or go bad. So I started putting water in 2-liter pop bottles, taking it to work and freezing it, and then I would just put two-liter pop bottles in that cooler and just swap one out every day or two, and it kept it right at between 33 and 40 degrees, which is a good temperature for your refrigerator. And it eliminated that moisture issue because the water was contained inside the pop bottles. Now that winter's here, I just stick the pop bottles outside, they freeze, and I do the same thing. Once summer comes, I'm going to have a source to freeze those bottles of water. Or what I'll probably do is I'll just get rid of the cooler altogether and just go back to eating fresh food that day, or eating the dry and canned goods. So that's the food preservation deal. There's other ways, obviously, to preserve food. But I don't know if I should really get into that. There's reasons I haven't done some of those other methods. One thing I'll mention is the Zier pot. I know somebody who had a Zier pot and it didn't work at all whatsoever, and it was winter time when the person was using it and it still didn't work. The food spoiled. Those Zier pots don't work. I don't know why people say they do. If you live in a certain environment, like perhaps Arizona, where there's very low humidity, then it might work. But in typical environment where you have varying temperatures from hot to cold and varying humidity from 100%, it just doesn't work. Other methods, smoking food. Obviously, where I live, again, it's location. I can have fires. There's not gonna be any issue with smoke or anything. So if I wanted to build a smoker, I could definitely do that, and I could smoke food and preserve it. But again, you're looking at a lot of time and effort into doing that, and you're also going to have, where I live, an issue with wild animals coming and tearing your smoker apart and getting at that food. I mean, we got lots of bears here and lots of other critters that are going to smell that from miles away, and they're all going to come looking for it. So you're going to have a way to keep the critters away. I could do a drying rack, and I could dry fish and meats and things of that nature, or even plants, dry them to preserve them. But again, here in Michigan, it's high humidity, so drying traditionally, even throughout Native American history, it wasn't a really good option. Because we have such high humidity and we have a lot of rain and snow and stuff, it makes it kind of difficult to get the food dry. If you can get it dry, it's even more difficult to keep it dry. You almost have to, again, resort to a non-self-reliant lifestyle where you're going out and buying lots of Ziploc bags and canning jars and things of that nature to try and keep it fresh and keep moisture from being able to get into it. So, but nevertheless, those are options. And again, if those type of options are what you're looking for, it all goes back to location. Make sure the location you select is going to be a viable location for those food preservation methods. For me, it's a lot easier just to use to buy the canned goods and dry goods rather than make them myself. Especially now that I'm working, I really wouldn't have the time to do all that. And again, if I did have the time, then I would have to have the money to buy, canning equipment, things of that nature. So it's all things to consider. all I can do is show you what I did and what I'm doing, and hopefully you can learn something from that, and maybe get you some ideas, and help you have a better chance of success in your off-grid or self-reliant endeavors. But that's pretty much it. If you have any questions or suggestions, maybe there's some food preservation methods or something that I haven't thought of as far as keeping fresh veggies and stuff, please, let me know. And if you have ideas for future videos in the off-grid series, please let me know that as well. I think I'll probably do one more on the solar power setup, really show that in detail and show how it's all wired in and everything, and show how I actually use it. And then I think I'll do probably do one, it depends, one on transportation and one on communication. Those are getting beyond the 4 basics of survival and more into living, but that's how this has progressed. When I first got here, it was strictly survival mode. How do I get shelter, water, fire, and food? Once I was settled in, then it was like, okay, let's look at some other options. How am I going to get around? How am I going to transport myself around and get stuff? How am I going to stay in touch with the outside world as far as communication, things of that nature? And the reason I'm going to do those 2 videos is because, again, I think it's something that a lot of people maybe don't think of when they choose a place to live, and then they, inadvertently set themselves up for failure because it just makes it much harder to live life when you don't have a way to get around or a way to communicate, especially in this modern age. I'm out in the middle of nowhere. I'm surrounded by woods, peace and quiet, lots of wild game and everything. I can pretty much do anything I want, and it's all legal, and nobody's going to complain. But I'm still close enough that I can come out in the woods, make a video on my phone, and right here in the woods, upload it to the internet. That's nice to be able to do. But again, I didn't pre-plan any of this. I just got lucky. But if you have the ability to pre-plan it, these are things that'll set you up for success, and you'll have a lot better chance of making it and enjoying it. Really, that's the number one thing, is not just to survive, but to be able to actually enjoy it and have fun doing it. So until next time, me and Shmoo, which is way up there now, say thanks for watching.